Welcome back, squad. Some best and worst matchups for week 8. Let's go. Like I said, squad, 4 of the best, 4 of the worst matchups. Let's jump right in. Up first, if you can believe it, the Broncos running backs against the Dallas Cowboys is a good matchup for them. Crazy, I know. The Cowboys are bottom 3 in fantasy points per game given up to running backs. They're bottom 8 in yards and touches overall. They're bottom 4 in receptions allowed to running backs, bottom 3 in targets allowed to running backs, and they're second worst in receiving yards allowed to running backs and rushing touchdowns allowed to running backs. This is a good matchup for them. Now, am I saying start RJ Harvey? Not necessarily, but if you were debating starting Dobbins, there's some interesting data there for that. This is a game that's going to score a lot of points. I like the running backs in this matchup. Up next, we're staying on the Dallas train. The Broncos wide receivers versus Dallas. Really, the quarterback is a great matchup too. So really, I should just say all offense versus the Cowboys. The Cowboys have allowed the second most fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers. This benefits guys like Courtland Sutton the most. As a defensive unit, they're top 3 in points allowed overall, just scoring points. They give up a lot of points. And they're second worst in fantasy points per game allowed to wide receivers. They're also 4th worst in red zone fantasy points per game and yards allowed to wide receivers. This is not a good defense. Matt Eberflus is there, and he is bad. Maybe more importantly, Dallas just throws the ball a ton because they score a ton. So Denver, likewise, will throw the ball a ton and score a ton. So again, high scoring game. Don't really have to say anything else. Up next is going to scare some people because he had a really bad game and burnt some people, myself included. Caleb Williams. He's playing the Ravens this week, and the Ravens have a bad defense against quarterbacks. I'd say a bad defense generally, but specifically I would say against quarterbacks. They're second worst in fantasy points per game allowed and red zone fantasy points per game allowed to quarterbacks. They average 22 fantasy points a game given up to quarterbacks, which is bad. They're bottom 7 in yards allowed, completions allowed. They're bottom 5 in interceptions as a unit. They're second worst in passing touchdowns allowed to quarterbacks. And this one I like maybe even a little more than the others. They're bottom 7 in rush attempts allowed to quarterbacks. Caleb did run last game for like -2 yards, and I get like kneeling, but he also like ran, right? He actively ran the ball and then he kneeled. And those were not all kneel downs, right? Surely not. I mean, I didn't watch the whole game, but surely not. It doesn't matter. If Lamar comes back, could see it as a shootout. If not, still not a bad option. This defense is not very good. And the last good matchup, I'm hesitant to say this because he's on the Jets. Breece Hall, if Tyrod Taylor starts. If you start Justin Fields, I swear to God, I swear, if they start that man, I'm going to run off the edge of a cliff. Not jump, just run. Just straight 20 miles an hour. I can't run that fast. Straight 6 miles an hour off the edge. What are we doing? The Bengals are not a good run defense. They're last in fantasy points per game given up to running backs. They're also last in red zone fantasy points per game given up to running backs. That's just like the cream of the bad crop. Is that a thing? They've given up the most touches, the most rush attempts, probably because they're bad. But Flacco's there now, so maybe they're a little better. And they're second worst in yards allowed. This is not a good run defense, although it's the Jets. And if it's not Tyrod, it's not going to be a shootout. Just Justin Fields is going to throw the ball 11 times in the whole game and complete half of his passes to like 2 running backs once, a tight end, 2 wide receivers, and then like to the other team. So like what do we, if Tyrod starts, I like Breece Hall in this matchup. If he doesn't, I like no one, and I want to go live underground. Now we're moving on to the negative Nancy portion, where I get to tear into people's matchups. Up first, Darren Waller. If he plays this week, I don't know that he's playing, but if he does, he has a bad matchup against the Falcons. It's kind of crazy how good the Falcons defense has been against tight ends this year. This past week, they played George Kittle coming back from injury, and he had 0 catches. Not one catch. And you might think, hey, he was coming back from injury. He wasn't on the field much. He was on the field over 80% of the time. He didn't catch one pass. They're second in targets allowed and first in catches, and they average less than 2 a game to tight ends. Not like the starting tight end, all tight ends on the team. That's insane to me. They're first in yards, they're third in touchdowns given up to tight ends, and they average less than 5 fantasy points a game given up to tight ends. Less than 5. That's crazy. Until that changes, I wouldn't start a lot of tight ends against the Falcons. Anyway, Waller has a bad matchup if he's playing. Up next, the Patriots running backs versus Cleveland's run defense. They're the best in the league in fantasy points per game allowed to running backs. They're third in yards per attempt allowed, and they average under 15 fantasy points per game to the entire team of running backs. Same concept as the tight ends. They're top 8 in yards and rushing touchdowns allowed in a game to running backs. And you might think, well, maybe you can throw on them. They're top 2 in receiving touchdowns allowed to running backs. They just don't let running backs do much. Achane had like a decent day, not even great, but like decent, and he had less than 13 fantasy points. And granted, he's on the Dolphins, but I don't trust Ramondre Stevenson against Cleveland. No. Ugh. Maybe Travion Henderson. I can't even. Oh, that man is just on an island of hate right now. I feel bad for him. Up next, it's the Chargers wide receivers versus the Vikings. This is the Thursday night game, and it's a little tough for the Chargers. The Vikings are the best team against wide receivers in fantasy points. They're the best against the perimeter, so that affects guys like Quentin Johnston. And they're 4th best against the slot, so that affects guys like Ladd. They're first in targets allowed to wide receivers, and they just blitz the heck out of any team they play. And now Herbert is playing with 2 legs and 0 linemen, who they all are like 300 pounds of brick, and they just don't move. It's like watching a mobile broccoli. As if there's mobile broccoli. What am I doing? He's going to have very quick throws, so maybe Ladd and Keenan, if anyone. Their line is just a pile of wet cement. So yeah, it's a tough matchup all around. I just don't like it. I think the Vikings are going to run the ball decently against the Chargers because their run defense has been hot garbage as of late. So something to note. And the last matchup is just one specific player, or one specific position, really. Is the Eagles slot wide receiver versus the Giants slot cornerback, Andrew Phillips. So the main 2 guys in the slot are Dotson, but mostly Devonta Smith. Smith plays in the slot over 60% of the time, which is a pretty high amount. And he plays Phillips, and it's not that Phillips is a great cornerback necessarily. He's on the Giants. He averages 0.27 fantasy points per route run given up, which isn't great numbers, and he lines up in the slot around 80 to 90% of the time, so he's there a lot. So you think, what's the problem, right? It's not a terrible matchup on paper. It's the Eagles against the Giants. The Giants aren't a good defense after last week. Andrew Phillips has committed the most defensive penalties of anyone in the league. Troy Franklin had 10 targets last week against him and had 3 catches. 1 was a touchdown. So there's always that potential. Smith could definitely score a touchdown, but I also think he's just going to get fouled. And sadly, in the fantasy world, fouls don't count for points. Crazy, I know. I think Smith could still have a decent day. I'm not saying he'll be bad necessarily. I think it's just going to be frustrating because I think Smith can have a really good day, but all the penalties that might hit him could hamper that or could maybe cap that. Again, not telling you start or sit, just kind of throwing the information out there and wanting you to make the decision because you're smart, right? Yeah, you are. Anyway, just something interesting to note with Devonta Smith and with Phillips. So that matchup is interesting, one I'm curious to watch this weekend. Overall, really excited for next week's slate of games. Feels crazy we are already in mid to late October. That's insane to me. We'll talk to you later.